Welcome to the Mental Insights Podcast. This is a community aimed at understanding all sides of mental health, addiction, and homelessness. Each interview will include either a personal story or an expert's advice within one of these fields. The goal of this project is to promote awareness, guidance, and support for anyone who is affected by these challenges. Thank you all for listening. Welcome back to episode number 4, season 2 of the Mental Insights Podcast. This is your host, Brendan Catulli, and we are here with Anthony Ogley. In this episode, we're going to be speaking about why mental architecture will be used in the future instead of mental health. If you haven't listened to the first part of the episode, check out how to upgrade mental software. For this episode, Anthony, we're really going to be diving deep into what mental architecture is. So to really start us off, explain the term mental architecture and why this is going to be the next approach for mental health.
So mental architecture is how your mind or what we think of as your individual mind is engineered and put together. And so if you look at one's mental capacities over multiple areas of intelligence, you will be able to then see where you've developed certain capacities, skills, levels of awareness, ability to execute, and where there's gaps in your knowledge and understanding. So often, there's this idea of, say, you have intelligence, or people are bright, but a lot of these terms, or mental health, but a lot of these terms require greater definition, more specificity. They require drawing distinctions between one thing or another. Well, what is great mental health? What are the characteristics of someone who has excellent financial intelligence? Well, they understand what value is. They understand their own value, and they understand value in the world in terms of contribution. They might understand how businesses work, what makes a good investment. They might have a really good understanding of pricing. They might have a good understanding of accounting, of budgeting, of all of these things, right? And so these you can think of as like capabilities of building blocks that make up financial intelligence. So physical intelligence, well, do you eat well? Do you move well? What's the shape of your body? How is your sleep regenerative? Do you rest well? Do you get into high performance states when you move, when you exercise, when you train? Are you flexible? Do you have a certain amount of strength, etc., etc., right? So again, these are all like building blocks and capabilities that you could then call the architecture of the mind.
And when you're looking at the architecture of the mind, there's many different aspects of, what is truly your own and how you can take yourself to the next level. Within that, I'm meaning conscious and unconscious thoughts. So what you are actually in control over, and what's going on within your mind as you're transitioning through this process when you're looking at these capabilities. So how can someone identify conscious versus unconscious thoughts throughout their day?
So results don't lie. That's the simplest way to look at this. Results don't lie. So if you identify where you're at in life and whether there are gaps or not in what you would most love to have in terms of results, right? And you can basically, to some extent, quantify your thinking and your like unskillful or unwise thinking by the amount of gap that there is between your ideal life and where you currently are. And then you can then look at that in terms of various different areas. Okay, so there is, how do I think, identity, how do I think about myself? What is my own self talk, for want of a better word, right? When I say I am, and I'm doing this, how am I talking about myself, to other people? And then you have like what you call belief structures, right? So what do I believe money is? Do I believe that money is a tool for creating impact and giving value and contributing into the world? And when I say do I believe that, is that, what, because you have a lot of people who you could say it and believe that at an intellectual level, and then you have some of the most generous multimillionaires in the world, somebody like Bill Gates, who is pouring all the money that he's made over the course of his career into these like projects for the benefit of humanity and society, right? So he's literally living that expression of money as a tool for value and contribution. Mm-hmm. So then you just look at your life. It's like, well, okay, my shoulder's in pain, my back hurts. Well, then what unconscious stuff must there be around how I think about my body and how I treat my body and how I love my body? And that can be either from not, that can be like a kind of undercare of not like eating healthily and not exercising, but it can equally be, people can do that from like overtraining. You can go out and do the next training, the next workout, and all of that kind of stuff, ultimately because you're trying to prove something to yourself about how you have value. So but it does come down to a very simple observation of what are the results that I have in my life, to what are the results that I'd like to have in my life, internally and externally. How happy would I like to be? How much joy would I like to have? How much love would I like to be surrounded by? And is that the truth of my life right now? If no, then I've probably got some amount of unconscious thinking, which then leads to unconscious habits, unconscious actions, unconscious behaviors, and then results that show up in my life that aren't, if I'm being honest with myself, are not fulfilling, do not make me happy, do not support and serve the highest version of myself and the highest possibility of what I can create in my life.
As you're describing this, you're speaking a lot about internal actions, internal behaviors, internal values that you need to reflect and work upon. But there can be other influences within our lives that can change some of these, or maybe they can lead us astray. What kind of impact can social influence, can other people have on our own mental architecture, and how we're able to use these capabilities to move forward within our own health?
So the answer to that is huge, particularly in terms of our environment and upbringing and conditioning. So I tend to look through a lens of what you would call the biopsychosocial lens, which effectively said we are products of our environment. And so we are influenced by what's going on around us. So for the first 7 years of our lives, science suggests that we're raised in an alpha state. We are simply drinking in everything that surrounds us, and this is our reality. And the amount of love, the amount of connection, the amount of support, the amount of presence we receive from the world, the amount of encouragement connects with us. But equally, you can have examples of twins who have more or less the same environment and the same things, and they can create two different versions of reality within their own world. So there's an open question of how much the outside world creates the inside world, of how much the we'll say information Yeah, so information comes in, we interpret that information within our biology, within our system, and that leads to us making certain choices about ourselves and the world, and then we act upon those choices. And this is how that system works. Now, that internal system is one of what you might call four systems. So you have the internal self, and then you have the external self, what you do in the world and the actions that you take. And then you have the we, what's going on in terms of like your family, your community, your environment, and then you have what's going on in terms of like systems, right? And so so systemic change is a very interesting subject at how you can change how you think about different things. So, for example, in Scotland, where I live, around 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, they changed the definition around violence. So from violence being a personal issue to like, you're violent, it's your fault, there's something wrong with you. And they reclassified violence as a disease, which meant that if somebody was violent, you can then treat the disease and separate the disease out from the person. When doing that, it also then means you can, if violence is a disease, if homelessness is a disease, you can then educate society around these issues to do with these subjects, and you relieve some pressure from the minds and the architecture of people who are suffering from these problems. So they are not the problem. The fact that they're carrying a disease is a problem, and that can be treated with support, and you can join that up in a systematic way. But all of that still started with one individual being able to realize and make that distinction, and them having the power to bring that to people who create those frames of reference within the government and within society. So we're always living under sentences within frames of reference that are created by someone. And the more you can create your own frames of reference, the more you can create your own results, your own sense of who you are, your own sense of identity, and live that, the more influential and impactful you become.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I love the, conversation of frameworks of changing that perspective, because oftentimes that's inevitably what we need. We need kind of that recontextualization. We need to look at it from a different viewpoint, which in our society today, this is one thing that has really been growing throughout different fields within health, within personal development. And I want to get your insights on it of, what can intensive retreats have on developing our own mental architecture? What is the benefit of having some intensive retreats today, and how can that change our framework, change our perception of how to move forward within our mental architecture, within our life in general?
So this is a very interesting question for me, because so intensive retreats can be absolutely and wonderfully life-changing. And what's the thing that's important is you can go there and you can get high, right? Particularly with a lot of retreats in personal development, you get high, you walk on hot coals, you get really super empowered and super stoked. But what's really important is that you understand the process of how your own system works, and that you leave, right? When you come home to your life, the question is, well, how are you going to integrate that? If you go to this place and you get really high and you set these massive goals and you suddenly get really excited, and then you come home and you don't achieve these things that you set out to do, you can end up in a far worse state than you were before you went to the workshop in the first place. So the important thing is to get into these states, but also is to set up structures and systems to enable success. And and the and so understanding your own system and your own needs in this particular way. So within the framework that I use that called Fresh Mind, it works upon like the fundamental architecture of human growth from a developmental point of view. So and the reason so many people are stressed in our society today is because we're effectively triggering our survival systems a lot of the time. So our body is basically like in sort of freeze, fight, or flight mode, like when there's no threat around in most situations, right? So we're going into this survival mode based on like wondering if we're going to have enough money to pay the rent next month, right? Or we're going into survival mode because we're worried that our wife might leave us or this stuff might happen, right? Now, that may be a threat to our sense of identity and a sense of who we are, but it's not a physical threat to our body. And so learning how to deal with that, learning how to calm into the parasympathetic nervous system so we can breathe properly. So this is why things like the Wim Hof method, why breath work is so effective, because that helps clear out all this all the stress and all the tension that our body's holding on to. And then you go into stage 2, which is about meeting our needs for security and survival. And that's about that's about knowing who your tribe are, and being willing to create your own sense of security and tell yourself the truth. Because often we have to leave our immediate support network if we want to go out in the world and be successful. And then you want to establish your own sense of power, your sense of value, your sense of worth, that you are and you have worth, like regardless of who you are and what you do, you have worthiness. And then there's a certain amount of status and worth and value that comes from having knowledge or having influence or having certain skills or abilities or whatever is important to you in terms of status. And then we also have then next we have like the rules and roles of how society governs itself. Which can be like the principles you have for a relationship. For example, these are my boundaries, these are my rules, or these are your rules. Okay, we can work with that, or we cannot work with that. And so again, it comes to when you understand how these rules operate, you then can be empowered to start choosing your own rules. And when you're choosing your own rules for life, you can then move up to level 5. You can set and achieve goals, you can play to win, you can enjoy material pleasures, etc., etc. Then that develops a sense of empathy and a sensitivity for other people's needs, the needs of the group, and tuning into where my goals might kind of impose on other people's needs. So how can I then how can I learn then collaborate between my goals and how other people win? So I'm not just playing a win-lose game in, say, professional sport, but I'm playing a win-win game where me winning means other people win. This is good. And then we look at like kind of what we'd call advanced needs, which is about balancing oneself with the whole of life. How much in harmony am I living with myself and therefore with the whole of life? And then we'd look to be what we call like free and fully functioning in every level of intelligence as much as possible. Right. So then if you start to like understand that system and then start to identify where you are, you can then see what progress that you need to make and where the gaps are in your mental architecture. Right. If I've never looked at diet, right, then I need to go and cover that. Or for example, in a lot of like tech companies, you have people who are really amazing at technical side of things, but they're running companies, but they don't know anything about leadership or about psychology or about what it takes to create a high performance team. So then it becomes obvious that like at some point you got to, in order to like get your business and the company to grow, you need to take on and learn something about these skills.
And for, within this, you're talking about these skills, these values, these principles, a lot of things that you can put into place within your life that can make these steps up within your system of these certain steps, these certain roles of taking yourself to the next level within somebody who, whether they're in a work field such as entrepreneurship and all what we've been speaking about so far. If someone can't go on one of these intensive retreats as we've spoken about, or can't speak with somebody who's a transformational coach such as yourself, what is kind of the go-to for somebody who's working right now, who needs to kind of just take this reflection of their mental architecture of trying to figure out, maybe what is the next step? Somebody who's kind of in that limbo, in that lost stage, what can somebody do initially to kind of maybe just take that 1% shift that we spoke about in the previous episode?
Well, there's a lot of things you can do. So you can start to meditate. You can look at your diet. You can look at your sleep habits. You can look at what, where do you find joy in your world? Where do you find fulfillment and happiness? And how can you give yourself 1% more of that, right? How can you start to develop a skill that you haven't learned but you've always wanted to? So I've just been reminded a book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to assume that it's absolutely brilliant because of the people who recommend it to me, like Atomic Habits. So it's not that complicated to start changing your behavior from doing things that are not so skillful to do things that are much more skillful and useful for your life, right? And so there's a lot of books you can pick up that Atomic Habits. There's Choosing Yourself with James Altucher. There's a number of different things. The world is full of videos of people giving amazing sort of tips and suggestions of very simple, actionable things that you can do in order to change how you see yourself, how you see the world, so you start doing the things that are more in line with what it is you want to do. You can and say if you're struggling, say, with anxious thoughts or depressed thoughts or even suicidal thoughts, that the first step to that is to notice and really slow down and take a moment to notice that they are thoughts. Because the moment that you start to notice that they are thoughts, you create a distance between the thought and you. And then you've got a choice. You see, that awareness brings a choice, because then you can choose whether to buy into that thought or not. And then the more you choose to be like, and the more you become aware, and I say this from personal experience because I've had all of those thoughts at one time or another. And it was just like, oh, I'm having, it went from like, oh, I want to hurt myself to like, oh, I'm having a thought that says, hurt yourself. Oh, that's interesting. And then the more interesting it became, the more it went away, and suddenly, I didn't have them again.
Wonderful. I thank you for bringing that up, because it really leads into how I want to wrap up this episode, being to really encompass a lot of what we've been speaking about. You're looking at mental health with a new approach of kind of contextualizing it into this term mental architecture. And within this, I want to ask you, right now you're doing transformational coaching, you're working with others to take that leap into a high performance leader. But if you were given a large sum of money, if you were given a hefty amount of, even say like $1 billion, where would you allocate these resources in order to build this new age of mental architecture, in order to, really take the next step in how you're bringing this approach of mental architecture to high performance leaders and to our society in general, and try to change the conversation about mental health into mental architecture.
Oh, okay, so it's this really easy because it turns out today I've been talking with some entrepreneurs who have created a educational platform that they're looking to scale and grow globally. And so if you give me $1 billion, I'll speak to those people. I'd speak to other people. So there's a company called Academy that's another education platform.
Mhm.
And they're teaching like thinking styles and capacities. And I would look to partner with those people to do the kind of like the inner clearing, emotional clearing stuff that goes along with that.
Mhm.
Um, and 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 then and then you're going to people like, you go to the Gates Foundation, you go to the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, and like, well, how do we look at, so for like an entrepreneurs are somewhere around 51% of entrepreneurs, according to a piece of research, will suffer from a mental health issue at some stage during their career.
Mhm.
And a lot of people think that 51% is massively underplaying the percentages, that it's probably at least as high as 80%,
Mhm.
right? And so we would then, you then go to these people, to the Thiel Foundation or the big people, and say, look, I've got this money. These are the issues with entrepreneurs. These are the issues with entrepreneurs' mental health, with other people's mental health, and we know that these are the issues, and this is the solution, and we want to roll this out, right?
Mhm.
With a sort of a platform that's been built, a team of highly skilled, highly aware coaches who can take people through this model and through this system, so that people can understand their own mental architecture, and then we can also partner with these educational organizations to have this knowledge and information kind of built into early childhood learning, so people are growing up raised with an understanding of their own needs. And if you can meet your own needs on an emotional, physical, mental, spiritual level, then you're going to have great mental health. It's that simple.
Wonderfully said, Anthony. I really appreciate that response, and that's certainly something I hope we can create. It's something that we can take to the next step, and we can have a organization such as that to make that step within providing this new age of mental architecture, providing these resources for what's going on within our society today. So I would love to thank you for being here today. Thank everyone for listening. We will have Anthony's work within the show notes so you can see more about what he is doing and get in contact if you would like to take that next step with Anthony, or just to see more of the work that he is doing. So be sure to listen to the previous episode of episode 4, season 2 of the Mental Insights podcast. Be sure to comment, let us know what you think. Subscribe to the Mental Insights podcast and let myself and Anthony know how you liked this episode. Thank you, Anthony, for taking this time with me. I greatly appreciate it.
Pleasure, Brendan. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening again to the Mental Insights podcast. This has been your host, Brendan Catulli. Thank you all for listening to this episode. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and review to this podcast. Let us know what you learned from this episode and what you would like to hear in the next episode. This has been your host, Brendan Catulli of the Mental Insights podcast. Have a wonderful day.